In this video, Bulgarian researcher The New Earth Lady wants to expose the proof that the mainstream history of the Khmer Empire gives us a very distorted version of what actually happened. The reason for such a misleading representation of history is to create the false impression that, first of all, we live in a civilization which evolves for the better. And the second false impression is that the driving force which caused the demise of the Khmer Empire was simply a byproduct of the alleged progress, which they want us to believe a newer, more progressive social structure replaced the older, outdated structures. The truth is that just a couple of hundred years ago, there still lived people who were fully aware of the older advanced civilizations on Earth. They kept clear written records about those civilizations, and still, to some extent, abided by the universal laws of goodness which they inherited from those civilizations. And that is why they had a society which surpassed ours in terms of prosperity, art, culture, management of natural resources, and much, much more. The Khmer Empire was just one of the branches of this worldwide culture, and the demise of the Khmer Empire was brought about by the forces that be, which embarked on destroying everything beautiful on Earth and plunging the human race to the bottom of ignorance and misery, she believes. Another interesting point she suggests about the Khmer megaliths are that they show evidence the original stonework, which is often attributed to a lost, very ancient civilization, was still widely used up till a couple of hundred years ago. And exactly within the Khmer megaliths, we see it de-evolve into brickwork. She would like to show us the evidence for all this and much more. Angkor Wat, the mass media and even some so-called history books, she suggests that in the year 1859, Henry Mohot discovered the amazing city that was lost in the jungle, and they would like to assure us that the locals who allegedly didn't even know about it, and this is not even mainstream history. Just one of the numerous earlier mentions of Angkor Wat is taken from this Japanese map. There was even a Japanese settlement at the time in Angkor Wat, which was dated in 1635. Japanese inscriptions are found on the walls of Angkor Wat, further confirming this. The people who built the temple complex, commonly known as Angkor Wat, belonged to the Vedic society. It's a sure bet, she suggests, that if you encountered them now, you would call them Hindus. And since in one of the previous episodes we saw how the Japanese, for all practical purposes, are Hindus themselves, their close ties with Angkor Wat isn't surprising at all. In a couple of rooms of the main temple in Angkor Wat, some of the original wooden doors are preserved. The floor here is modern, but the doors are original. So if the complex was indeed built some 1,000 years ago, how comes this wood didn't rot in this moist and hot tropical environment, she asks. If it was indeed left unattended for centuries, as they are telling us, it would have rotten away and the bugs would have eaten them a long time ago. Here, the original wooden elements, she claims, can be clearly distinguished from the modern support because of their decoration. Is it possible, she asks, that these wooden doors were actually made during historic renovations and didn't belong to the original temple? She doesn't think so, because although there were minor traces that here and there the Hindu temples were later reused as Buddhist temples, it was clearly visible that they were refashioned without the finest of refinement that the original builders of the temples displayed. And it is out of the question, she claims, that they could have rebuilt such doors with such elaborate carvings. The carved doors are most definitely original, and they show that Angkor Wat is not as old as they are telling us. As you can see, the doors are not found in deeply hidden, protected places. They are very close to the outside environment, which is very hot and humid. The way in which some of the Khmer temples, she states, actually on a couple of them, are overgrown with these trees. Certainly it creates a very mystical atmosphere. But being mystical should not be confused with being very old, because an actual critical study of the situation regarding the overgrown trees also shows evidence, she states, that the full complex was not abandoned a long time ago, as they are trying to convince us, but in much more recent times. This spectacular species of tree, of which there are a couple of varieties of them, have an unusual lifespan of around 100 years. Sometimes they could even live up to 200 years. If this complex of temples scattered around the jungle over a very large area of tens of kilometers, if this was abandoned for many centuries, she states, there should have been many generations of such huge trees which lived and died, and their trunks remaining dry. She visited Angkor Wat several years ago, and this was not at all what she observed. Actually, she continued, only a couple of numerous temples are overgrown with such spectacular trees. The fact, let's say 80% of these temples are unaffected, speaks for itself, and again, as she claimed, they are scattered here and there in the jungle. They are not clustered at one place, which is somehow protected from seeds dropped by the trees. There is no question of the lack of seeds. It is not that the big trees are missing, because they were all removed during restoration. They can't be removed so easily because the roots grow in between the stones, and to remove them you would need to first dismantle the full building. So it's not the case that a couple of decades ago there were much more trees, and now they are simply cleaned up. No, she states, there is no claim that this is the case, and it can't be the case. The number of trees is one thing, but also their size. There are very few huge and spectacular trees, whereas there are small trees with smaller diameters of thickness in their hundreds. in these couple of overgrown temples. So this also shows that the place was abandoned relatively recently within our historic time periods. Otherwise, we would find around the numerous dried trunks of huge trees. Notice here, she suggests, all the trees are small. Really big, spectacular trees, she claims, are very, very rare. Also in recent years, articles stated appearing in the media claiming it's urgent as the trees started destroying Angkor Wat at an alarming rate. So the questions, were they not doing this for hundreds of years since it was abandoned, and now we take care of it and all of a sudden the trees all start going crazy and started destroying it at an alarming rate? How come the so-called mainstream historians don't understand that this makes their fantasy stories very shaky? Stories which have suggested that everything is very old and lost, forgotten civilizations from a long time ago. That's why they write sheer nonsense, she claims, such as the trees that before were supporting our city are now destroying it. How come before they were all supporting it? Well, the way they explain it is, she covered earlier, that the branches are in between the stones and serve as a mesh between them. So now, with an alarming rate, they are no longer serve as this mesh, as they were doing for hundreds of years, and now they become killers of temples. No, she states, not at all. The truth is that we can't even properly maintain them. Not so long ago, people used to use them. People maintained them properly and took care of them because they were the boats of their gods. And why do they pay the mainstream historians to confuse people that the culture of Angkor Wat was obliterated in faraway times and not very recently, she asks. Because that would reveal the true colours of certain modern governments which operate under the mask of being humane, she claims. While in reality, they've destroyed peaceful societies and thrashed them completely. Those on top don't do the dirty work themselves. They need folks like us, she believes, to do the dirty work. Fools who believe that waging wars can be justified. Even as recent as the age of photography, we see the real Khmer people dressed as characters on the carvings of the old temples. So obviously they belonged to the same culture. They maintained their temples. Before the previously mentioned fools, that means me and you, came and poisoned their lives with stupid ideology, and of course everywhere the same pattern unfolded. France adopted Cambodia as a protectorate. Look at the words, adopting. That means to take care, as if you adopt a child. Then another very misleading term, protectorate, again comes from protection. And did they have any protection intent in their minds when they invaded Siam, murdering the locals, she suggests, to take control of the ruins? In these modern times, she claims, we, the arrogant fools, we are free to visit Cambodia and feel very good about ourselves by giving a few cents to the people we have handicapped in the name of goodness and progress and spreading democracy around the world. And how wonderful that the people who will accept these few cents equally believe all these lies about progress. And that's why they want to send their kids to modern schools, thus securing a complete wipeout of their memory of times when the Khmer people, who were related to their gods and built complex monuments which were far larger than the famous Egyptian pyramids combined, not to mention how superior the Khmer temples are in terms of their elaborate art. A local guide showed her some writing on the temples and was explaining that these were in a language that they no longer understand at all. He said, "Now we have a completely new language." She asked him when did this radically new language occur, and he said it was created between the 19th and 20th century.
20th century. Khmer modern language created.
By whom?
By Chunam. By Von Mang. By Von Mang. Name of Chunam. The Mang. Khmer modern language created. Maybe in 20th century.
This, she claims, seems to be the standard procure. Once the parasite paradigm engulfs a culture of goodness, one way to suffocate it is, he says, to create a new language by one man, she says. So one man is paid to create a new language which is later forced onto the population by the government, and is a very effective way to disconnect the people from the sources of the old knowledge. Even if they manage to get hold of some old books that have escaped destruction, they won't be able to understand what it says due to linguistic problems. This tactic, she suggests, wasn't adopted only in faraway exotic places, but also, as we will see in future episodes, in Europe as well. So after seeing with her own eyes the sheer size of the largest complex of temples on earth, along with the level of craftsmanship of the countless temples and gardens, she was left with many questions which have remained unanswered. First of all, let's see how everything was built. Most of it seems, indeed, to be the result of simple manual work. The chisel marks are clearly visible, and maybe we could say that this is a similarity with most of the stones. It's not hard to study them. One can find them in abundance all over the place. But yet other stones definitely don't make sense in that context. Just look at this stone, she suggests. It's got chisel marks, then on the left side it looks as if some sort of cast concrete. The academic explanation for this, of course, is that the stone was originally shaped with chisels, and then they started rubbing it like crazy against another stone until both of them became perfectly smooth to fit each other. Here are some examples of how well they fit. If somebody would be kind enough to provide a practical demonstration of something like this, she would be inclined to believe that by such a technique of precision stonework has been achieved for fitting these types of stones. When we have two perfectly flat surfaces facing each other, maybe that could be achieved by the technique described, namely endless rubbing until we fall unconscious. But as far as these types of stones, she can't wrap her mind around these types of surfaces could be the result of rubbing. After all, she points out, the lines continue from one stone to the other. Of course, such internal smooth surfaces on the stones could be achieved by other means, which do not require sophisticated technology, but then the question is, why would they make their lives so difficult? She asks. That would be a titanic amount of work, on which millions of men would need to work full-time on only smoothing the inside surfaces of the stones, which are not even visible on the outside. And the question is not only how would they, but did they? Because obviously they knew a smarter way of building, for example, casting, she believes. They were casting each and every individual brick, as you can see. There are bricks, at least in the initial stages when it was still in transition from megaliths to bricks, which we can see were not a standard size. What she is referring to is that if they knew how to cast bricks, polygonal bricks, probably on the spot, then why wouldn't they do that with the bigger stones, she asks. Here you can see each and every brick has got its own original unique matches, not only with the neighbouring bricks, but also in the form of columns, and shortly we will see they also made statues, sculptures of them. Please have a careful look at this particular brick. What is the strange line in the middle, she asks. Were they about to make 2 bricks and then change their mind in the middle of the operation? And how do you make 2 bricks out of 1 anyway? By drawing lines? That's pretty interesting, she states. Although she has no clue what was going on with this brick, she can tell us for sure that there are similar magnetic stones in Peru and Turkey. Some look like they have been glued to each other, or parts of the full wall is like this. But how they glued them together she is not sure. This is not just a small, curious detail. The same situation is found with absolutely huge megalithic blocks of the Elf castles, and places that are also little connected. How does that work, she asks. Hopefully she can find out during one of the upcoming expeditions, because she recognizes this is a key point which needs to be understood if we want to figure out how they managed to make at least the older, impressive megaliths. A couple of more points which kind of make her inclined to think that chiseling stone was used along with casting, or some sort of softening of the stone, that are both techniques, were probably used alongside each other. First of all, at a couple of spots where the quality of the masonry work was at its highest, she noticed a kind of pieces of brick inside the stone. There weren't that many of them, she states, but still, that could be some sort of supporting evidence. This is a huge original stone, but here it's interesting. The top layer is somewhat different from the rest. So here it blends well, but here not so well. Now let's get back to this particular image and have another look at the edge of the stone. It leaves the impression that it was soft, and then it hardened here on the spot. And again, this is a spot where the megalithic blocks fit each other with absolute precision, and not at places where chisel marks are visible. And the fitting is not that precise. So That again makes her inclined to believe that the technique of casting or softening was used along with the chiseling. Another small clue are these holes on the pyramid that really don't look chiseled. Rather, they look as if they were made when the stone was in a softened state. Now and then the arts of this particular kind left an impression with her. It looked as if it was kind of wet pressed in with something sharp when the stone was soft. Now we will delve into detail about the transition from polygonal megaliths all the way to standard bricks, and the standard sizes, she states. They were like this. Each and every brick had a unique size, and she still has no clue how they cut the image into the wall. Here, the nose brick blends so well. What is particularly informative is that we can see the gradual evolution. Like this is between bricks and stones, again polygonal because each piece is uniquely shaped, although not very well pronounced, but still it is, she points out. Here also we are on the border between polygonal bricks and polygonal stones. Here again, we are in a grey area between bricks and stones, she believes. It looks like bricks because they look small in the photograph, but if you compare them with the people, they're actually brick stones. Here we have some sort of stone art which is actually cement hard, but you wouldn't even guess it if it wasn't falling apart partially, and the bricks wouldn't have even been exposed, she states. Which is again more proof that they knew how to make cement, or geopolymer, which looks like stone. Here again, would you call these bricks or stones, she asks. They're just in between. At places where the cement batch was well mixed, it still looks very good. But at other places where they used a mixture of lesser strength, the naked truth about the stone sculptures is exposed, she states. There are lots of evidence that the Khmer megalith buildings were not just local, but was part of a worldwide building technique, she believes. The evidence of this are endless, she states, like the extensive use of clamps and the polygonal shape of the blocks. Obviously the approach that they used also matches that of Egypt and Peru and so on. First, they would make a hill of stones, an extremely large one, she believes, and then they would carve everything out of it. Do you see this line? First the stones are placed, and then the line was cut, because it curves, and that curvature passes through a couple of stones. Here's another illustration. Here the chisel marks cross the gap between the stones, and they continue on to the neighbouring stones. And these were the same people building this type of structure all over the world. That's why in Egypt and in Turkey and Russia we see the same technique. Long lines cut through multiple stones. That's because they always use the same technique. First, place all the stones, and then do all the carving or shaping of rooms, doors, windows, and balconies. That's exactly how they did it, she states. That's exactly how they did it, she states. That is the mainstream version, and this is exactly what she saw. but only in the temples of the older generation, when people still had the knowledge of how to deal with such gigantic proportions. Later, as the devolution of the brick occurred, various elements were cast and placed next to the bricks, like doors, ornamental window borders, columns, etc. And this culture was devolving worldwide as the consciousness of the people was getting lowered. The structures they were building became gradually flimsier and flimsier, but still there was a unique technique used all over the world, like these are examples from Europe of the same things. Figures cast out of cement on the top of the bricks. Even at the same point we had very successful stone imitations, and as we slide further on the timeline we get nearer and nearer to the current moment of our glorious history, she thinks. Now we're all about the level of monkeys. And in a couple of decades we'll be as smart as macaques. Let's see how durable and beautiful our restoration work is at Angkor. If you switch on your radio or the TV, somebody will be stating about cutting-edge technologies. So how come people with blunt edges, allegedly 1,000 years ago, made bricks that still last while our bricks, left outside in the weather, fall apart in a decade, if not much less, she asks. Why is there such a lack of correlation between the cutting-edge technologies and the benefits derived from it for the common people indeed, she asks. We have some access to cutting-edge technologies, but they're given to us only in small amounts, enough to entice us from our beautiful life in houses amongst nature so that we can get trapped in cities, where we lost our freedom, she believes, because we can no longer grow clean food. The cutting-edge technologies all boil down to a simple process, convincing the people to manufacture and install within themselves various devices and substances, all designed to connect the human consciousness to a central hub, which would be capable of remotely controlling all those who had voluntarily agreed to become part of that network, she believes. That's why the common people get little or no benefit of the real cutting-edge technologies. They assume and expect that the technologies will improve their lives as suggested by the Hollywood movies, but in reality, the techniques are introduced for an entirely different purpose. The sheer scale of the construction of the Khmer Empire itself makes it clear that we don't really understand much of what has been going on there, she states. Look at this map, she states. Some of the temples are spread over many square kilometers. The building with the main altar in the middle, who would be the size of a small hill itself, and then a couple of layers of walls, all of them covered with elaborate carvings. Even the forests around that are full of art and sculptures, shrines and altars, and more walls with carved stone, even on the top of the moats, this is a very modest one. The bigger ones simply reach to the horizon, and we are told that it was all handmade by hard-working Cambodians. She doesn't believe this last statement. Looking at this historic population of Cambodia, just imagine they are implying that in terms of the Khmer Empire, there was just a couple of 100,000 people, and they dug out all those lakes, built the stone mountains, covered them with quality carvings, and still had so much time to spare that they even polished all the blocks of the stone hills inside. This, of course, is laughable, she claims, but the situation with the artificially made canals and bodies of water is quite serious. Because they are not local to the area of Angkor, they spread all through the vast Khmer Empire. Angkor Wat is just one of the centres, and there are endless other temples with square kilometres of stone hills and thousands of elaborate carvings, murals, art, and more temples. The canal networks are very wide and are amazingly straight, which spread outside the Khmer Empire. This is an example of one canal used right up to today and is an average width of 60 metres. This is just an example of the network of canals. The yellow segment is 45 kilometres long and is perfectly straight and very deep, as if made for ships, and it goes all the way to Vietnam and the neighbouring countries and beyond. Officially, we were told it was built by the primitive farmers by hand to water their fields. But in reality, the farmers are actually building nowadays are just short, irregular segments which connect their fields to the canals they have inherited. Farmers can do this perfectly, and it's within their capacity. But for the bigger canals, which are deep and suspiciously wide and form perfectly straight lines for dozens of kilometres, for that you need engineers to measure it precisely, and then you need very serious equipment to carry out the enormous digging work. As usual, all the soil that has been taken out from the bigger canals is nowhere to be found. And it doesn't end there, she states. This network of canals is also interwoven with the network of lifelines which allegedly encompass the full earth. Here, on this image, we see, she suggests, that they have given a very interesting name to one of the minor canals. They call it Siem Reap River. A very original name, she continues. For example, one could name their cat Siem Reap Squirrel, and then hope that the people around it wouldn't notice that it's actually a cat. Here you can compare a modern town on the right, Ta Sing, with just a single temple complex from the time when the people were still great, she suggests. Compared not only the size, but also the precision. The orderly manner in which the whole complex has been built, and by the way, she continues, we have been discussing only building all this stuff, but this is just the beginning of everything. These are Vedic temples, and what she means is that we can find out by making parallels with the functional Vedic temples in India. She spent time in such a temple, and she assures us that it needs hundreds of Brahma priests for maintenance, because all these deities require regular offerings, many times a day. It is a must, she states. It's not optional, and that requires lots of resources. Not just in terms of labour, but also the offerings of ghee, which is purified butter, lots of milk, yogurt, flowers in very large quantities. She can't even imagine how beautiful these large gardens were when the temples were in their prime time. This must have been such a rich and prosperous culture. And do you see the shiny, cheap metal jewellery and paraphernalia this girl is using, she asks. Well, in the older times all this was gold. And not like our gold, but pure gold, without exception. She continues to assure us from her experience in India. Over there till the present day, every middle-class family, if you see them, you will think they are poor, but each and every one, she states, has buried somewhere in the garden a minimum of 4 kilograms of pure gold. When they get their daughters married, they give a full jewellery setup, top to bottom, with heavy jewellery, and everything is pure gold. Otherwise nobody will take the girl. Nowadays, she claims the British have successfully planted and harvested the seeds of poison and destruction which obliterated almost everything good and holy in India. The fact that the British destroyed highly prosperous Vedic kingdoms when they arrived in India is not denied by mainstream history. It is simply skipped over. That's why most people are not aware of it. Om Namo Shivaya. Om Namo Shivaya. The situation with the massive network of canals and lifelines is perplexing. Here we can see with special technology a structure which looks like some sort of piece of modern technology but is actually underground, 1.5 kilometers long. She states she doesn't understand the image very well, but if these are tombs, then definitely the installation below ground and the tombs are somehow connected. If this underground technical-looking installation was on ground level, the archaeologists would have concluded with great certainty that this is a maze for the concubines of the king to play in. But since it's buried, they would have to play another card. Oh, it's a mystery. Her personal conclusion, she believes, out of all this, we are quite far from understanding much about who the Khmer people were. Based on the ruins that she saw, she would say the Lord of the Khmer was Shiva. Although there are deities and depictions of all other Vedic gods, definitely the Shiva lingas, or the deities of Shiva, outnumber them for sure, she believes. Out of all the highly questionable stories, she states, with which the archaeologists clog their heads, particularly distasteful, she finds, are their wild fantasies about the Khmers. They say King Suryavarman must have built all this because of wild superstition and fear from this and that, she states, or because he wanted to brag, or because he wanted to prove himself as this or that. This effort by the archaeologists to use this impressive splendour of Angkor Wat, which inspires in those who see it to endorse sick ideas, to poison people's minds by subtly and cunningly that all rulers were low-quality people, she states, like the ones we have today. Although in reality, she doesn't know who and when this amazing complex of temples was built. Doesn't it make much more sense to suggest that if they were self-centered and vain, they would have built harems and palaces for their own use, instead of fashioning all these stone wonders for the gods? Because that's what the temples are. They are abodes of the gods. Why don't they ever say these temples might have been built by the righteous king who cared for his subjects, and that's why he built this paradise, she believes. There is also the Vedic literature that makes claim that there were lots of righteous and really noble Vedic kings. That's when the Vedic system was actually functional, not like nowadays in India, where we have a pale reflection, rotten from the inside, she states. Shiva, the Lord of the Khmers. Who is he, she asks. The truth is that he is an aspect of a personality which is far beyond our scope of understanding. Exactly like this small insect, for example. It's got a nervous system, some sort of understanding of the environment, of the other creatures around it. It also feels and understands things to a certain extent, but does it mean that it can feel or understand the complexities of human life the way we understand them, she asks? No, she states. It can never do that because it doesn't have the body which is geared for such a purpose. If the soul of this insect gets born into a human body, then it will be able to understand them. And in the same way, since Shiva is an aspect of the supreme all-pervading consciousness. Some people call the consciousness of God, for example, or the supreme God. We can't comprehend that level of consciousness with our current human body, and that's why the definitions of Shiva, which we may attempt to give, may end up being very limited and partial, she states. But, yet on the other hand, we can describe very well with our human capability the results from worshipping Shiva. To describe them using very modern language, because she noticed by using traditional terms leads to misunderstandings due to such terms often coming from preloaded religious connotations. By worshipping Shiva with sincerity, dedication, and a clear understanding of what you want, you will get plugged in, connected to a specific cosmic energy which will start flowing into your body. The physical changes they will make will be rather slow, but the installation of a new operating system into your psyche will be much faster. This operating system will not be like the new operating systems that we get for our computers, which are usually worse than the previous version, she states. The new operating system from Shiva will simply allow you to perceive more subtle levels of reality, which are always there, but you didn't have the tools to see them. Hollywood has been brainwashing us for a long time, and that spirituality is about believing in nonsense, or things that don't have a separate existence of their own outside of the imagination of the believer. Millions have bought into this propaganda, and that's why they imagine the spiritual people as irrational, stupid, ungrounded, believing in nonsense. This is a very modern misunderstanding of ancient spirituality that was exactly for those who understood our reality better, who saw more than the others. And these types of blessings were the Khmeric people receiving from Shiva, their lord, and that's why they lived in a society far superior to ours, she believes. Perceiving more from the other layers of existence is not something disconnected from anything. Perceiving more from the other layers of existence is not something disconnected from anything we call practical in our lives, she believes. Actually, it is the most practical thing because it can be used in manipulating the events and circumstances within this very limited sphere that most people nowadays call reality. We perceive it as a tangible reality. For the Khmer people, it was only the more dense portion of reality, she states.